The plaza erupted into chaos as human dropships descended from the night. Sky Khazari soldiers scrambled for cover as precision strikes took out defensive positions. And the crowd of human civilians scattered in every direction. Yuna grabbed Tasana and her brothers and pulled them toward the nearest shelter. As energy bolts screamed overhead, how did they know where to find us? Minjae shouted over the noise of battle. I do not know, Yuna replied. But then she saw him reach for his collar and pull out a small device that blinked with a steady green light. Emergency beacon, Minjae said with a weak smile. I activated it the moment you opened my cell. The United Earth Alliance forces had been waiting at the edge of the demilitarized zone for 3 months. Unable to act without confirmation of prisoner locations, Yuna had spent that time building an intelligence network and planning a rescue, never knowing that the final piece of the puzzle was a tiny beacon hidden in a prisoner's uniform. Now, human soldiers poured from the dropships with weapons blazing, pushing back the Khazari defenders and establishing a perimeter around the plaza. We need to get to the extraction point. Captain Dowan's voice crackled through a communicator that one of the soldiers pressed into Yuna's hand. Can you guide the prisoners to the eastern gate? I can do better than that, Yuna replied. I have guides who know every tunnel and back alley in this compound. She turned to Tasana. Can you get us out? Tasana nodded with fierce determination and let out a sharp whistle that cut through the sounds of battle from every shadow and corner of the plaza. Cubs emerged. They flowed out of drainage grates and down from rooftops and through gaps in walls that adult eyes would never notice. Nearly 30 young Khazari who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Follow us, Tasana commanded. And the cubs began to lead the prisoners and human soldiers through routes that bypassed the heaviest fighting. Yuna stayed at the rear of the group, helping the weaker prisoners keep pace while the battle raged around them. She saw Khazari soldiers fall to human weapons and human soldiers fall to Khazari claws, and she felt the weight of every death pressing down on her conscience. This was war, and war meant death, and no amount of planning or good intentions could change that terrible truth. They were almost to the eastern gate when Dominarch Wrath appeared. In front of them, his armor was scorched, and his face was bleeding from a wound across his brow. But his eyes still burned with the cold fury of a predator denied its prey. You will not escape, he snarled, raising his blade toward Yuna. I will kill you myself, and damn the consequences. Tasana moved to intercept him, but Wrath backhanded her aside with a blow that sent her tumbling across the ground. Tasana, Yuna screamed. Starting toward the fallen Kubra's blade swung toward her, and then Varric and Kel threw themselves at the Dominarch's legs, biting and clawing with all the desperate strength of children fighting for someone they loved. Wrath stumbled, and in that moment of imbalance, Tasana surged back to her feet and drove her small body into his chest. The Dominarch crashed backward into a support beam, and his blade clattered from his grip. Human soldiers rushed forward to restrain him, and Yuna dropped to her knees beside Tessanev. Young Khazari was bleeding from a gash across her ribs where Wrath's blow had torn through scales and flesh. You protected me, Yuna said, her voice breaking. Pack protects pack, Tasana replied weakly. That is the only law that matters. They carried Tasana and the wounded to the extraction point, where human medical teams were already setting up field stations. The battle was winding down as more Alliance forces arrived, and Khazari defenders either surrendered or fled when dawn broke over the occupied zone. The United Earth Alliance flag flew above the central plaza in the aftermath of the battle. Yuna found herself standing before a gathering of Alliance officers who wanted to understand what had happened. She told them about the Cubs, about the network they had built, about the intelligence they had gathered, about the courage they had shown in facing an enemy that had thrown them away. Officers listened with expressions that ranged from disbelief to wonder. You are telling us that our greatest intelligence Asset in this conflict was a pack of orphaned alien children. General Morrison said finally, "I am telling you that 30 children, who had every reason to hate everyone, chose instead to help." Una replied, "And I am telling you that they want to leave Kasari territory and find somewhere they can live without fear." The general was silent. "For a long moment, that will require negotiations with multiple governments and agencies. Then I suggest you start negotiating." 6 months later, Una stood on the landing pad of New Geneva, Earth's largest colony world. Watching a transport ship descend through the clouds, Tasana stood beside her. Fully healed and wearing the simple clothing of a refugee rather than the rags of a fugitive, 47 Kasari cubs had been granted asylum in human territory. And more were arriving every month as the peace negotiations continued. The war had not ended, but it had changed. The images of Kasari children standing between a human woman and a Kasari blade had spread across both civilizations, forcing people on all sides to question what they thought they knew about their enemies. "The delegation from the Kasari Provisional Government arrives tomorrow," Tasana said. "They have specifically requested you as a negotiator." "I know," Una replied. "Apparently, I have a reputation." "You have more than a reputation," Tasana said. And something in her voice made Una turn to look at her. "The cubs call you the bridge builder now. The one who showed us that enemies can become family." "I did not build anything," Una said. "You and your siblings did all the work. You gave us something to work for." The transport ship landed, and its doors opened to reveal a group of young Kasari being escorted by human aid workers. They were thin and scared and scarred by experiences that no child should have to endure. But their eyes held a spark of hope that made Una's heart. Tasana moved forward to greet them, speaking in rapid Kasari that Una's translator could barely keep up with. The new arrivals listened with expressions that shifted from wariness to wonder as Tasana explained where they were and what awaited them. One of the youngest cubs, barely old enough to walk steadily, broke away from the group and approached Una. The cub stared up at her with huge yellow eyes. "You are the quiet hunter," the cub said. "The one who walks alone into enemy lands." Una knelt so that she was at eye level with the child. "I used to walk alone," she said softly. "But I am not alone anymore." Tasana returned to stand beside Una, and Varric and Kel emerged from the crowd to join their sister around them. Human and Kasari children mingled with a ease that their elders could barely comprehend, playing games and sharing food and building friendships that crossed the boundaries of species and culture. "What happens now?" Kel asked quietly. Una looked at the children around her. At the world, they were building one small act of trust at a time. "Now we show them what we showed each other," she said. "That kindness is not weakness, that enemies are just friends we have not made yet, and that the smallest hands can change the course of history." Tasana made the sound that Una had learned to recognize as Bisidashos. Kasari laughter. "You sound like a philosopher." "I sound like a woman who walked into enemy territory expecting to die and walked out with a family instead." She put her arm around Tasana's shoulders and watched. The sun set over their new home behind them. The war still raged and the future remained uncertain, and 1,000 challenges waited to be faced. But here, in this moment, a human and a Kasari stood together as mother and daughter, and that, Una thought, was a victory worth more than any battle. The children would inherit a universe of conflict and division, but they would also inherit the knowledge that another way was possible. She had walked alone into enemy lands. She had walked out leading an army of the small and the forgotten and the brave. And together, they would build bridges that no war could destroy. The first explosion of chaos came exactly on schedule. Una heard it from deep in the drainage tunnels. A series of alarm sirens, screaming to life across the eastern compound, followed by the confused shouts of guards trying to understand what was happening. Power Station 3 just went dark, Morik whispered from somewhere in the shadows. And Stations 5 and 7 will follow in 30 seconds. The Cubs had spent 3 days identifying the most vulnerable points in the compound's infrastructure. The junction boxes and relay stations and emergency systems that kept everything running smoothly now. They were taking them apart piece by piece more. Alarms joined the chorus above. And Yuna could hear boots pounding on metal grating as guards rushed to respond to failures that seemed to be erupting everywhere at once. The detention block guards have been called to assist with the power failures, Kel reported, his voice calm despite the chaos. Only 3 remain at their posts. That is our window, Tasana said. And Yuna felt a small hand take hers in the darkness. Follow me. They moved through the tunnels with a speed that made Yuna's heart pound. Taking turns she could not see and climbing through access hatches she could barely fit through above them. The compound descended further into confusion as more systems failed and more alarms demanded attention when they emerged from a maintenance hatch into a dimly lit corridor. Yuna found herself face to face with a Kasari guard, who was just as surprised to see her. The guard opened his mouth to shout. But before any sound could emerge, 3 small shapes dropped from the ceiling vents and swarmed over him. Cubs wrapped themselves around his legs and arms, and one clamped small hands over his snout to muffle any sound. The guard struggled. But he was fighting against children who knew that their lives depended on keeping him silent. And within seconds, Tasana had pressed a stolen shock stick to his neck and dropped him unconscious to the floor. Move quickly, Tasana hissed. The detention cells are 30 meters ahead. They ran. Yuna's lungs burned and her legs ached. But she forced herself to keep pace with the Cubs who flowed around her like shadows. 2 more guards fell to the same ambush tactics. And then they were at the detention block door. Vorik produced a keycard that he had stolen from a sleeping officer the night before. And the door slid open to reveal a row of cells containing 12 humans who stared at their rescuers with expressions of pure disbelief. Dr. Seong, a familiar voice said. And Yuna felt tears threaten as she recognized Minjae Park standing at the front of the nearest cell. What are you doing here? Rescuing you, she said, moving to the control panel to begin opening the cells. And we need to move now because we have maybe 5 minutes before they realize what is happening. The prisoners stumbled out of their cells on legs weakened by weeks of captivity. And the Cubs immediately moved to support those who could not walk steadily on their own. These are Kasari children, one of the soldiers said with confusion and suspicion. These are our allies. Yuna replied firmly, and they have risked everything to save you. So, I suggest you follow their lead. They moved back into the maintenance tunnels with the prisoners in tow. A ragged group of humans and Cubs fleeing through the darkness while chaos continued to rage. Above them, for a few precious minutes, Yuna allowed herself to believe that they were going to make it then. Dominar Tereth stepped out of the shadows ahead of them with a squad of soldiers at his back. The Cubs scattered into side passages with the instinct of creatures who had spent their lives evading predators. But the prisoners were too slow and too weak to follow within seconds. Yuna found herself and the 12 humans surrounded by Kasari. Warriors with weapons raised and teeth bared. Reth was tall even by Kasari standards. His scales a deep red that was almost black, and his eyes held a cold intelligence that made Yuna's skin crawl. The human spy, he said with something that might have been satisfaction. I knew you were more than you pretended to be. I am a doctor, Yuna said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. I came here to heal people. You came here to steal our prisoners and undermine our authority, Reth replied. And you will die for it, but not quickly, he gestured to his soldiers. Take them to the plaza and prepare the execution grounds. and make sure that every human in the occupied zone is present to watch. The soldiers moved forward to seize the prisoners, and Yuna felt rough hands grab her arms and force them behind her back as they were marched through the compound toward the central plaza. She caught glimpses of small faces watching from the shadows. The cubs had not abandoned them. Whatever was about to happen, they were still there, still watching. Still waiting for any opportunity to help. The plaza was already filling with humans who had been dragged from their homes to witness the execution, and Kisari soldiers lined the perimeter, with weapons ready to punish any sign of resistance. Rith mounted a raised platform at the center of the plaza and addressed the crowd with a voice that carried easily across the open space. These humans were caught attempting to sabotage our facilities and free enemy prisoners, he declared. And in accordance with Dominion law, they will be executed as spies and traitors. The human crowd shifted uneasily, and somewhere a child began to curse, turned to face Yuna with undisguised contempt. You will die first, he said. As an example to any who would defy the Dominion, he raised his weapon, a curved blade that gleamed in the harsh lights of the plaza, and then 3 figures stepped out of the crowd and placed themselves directly between Reth and Yuna. Tasana stood at the center with Varric and Kel flanking her, their small bodies forming a living barrier in front of the human woman. The plaza fell silent. Rith stared at the cubs with an expression that shifted from surprise to recognition to fury. The alpha whelps, he snarled. I should have known you were behind this, Dominarch Reth, Tasana said, her voice ringing clearly across the plaza. I am Tasana of the Alpha bloodline, daughter of Pack Leader Varos and Pack Mother Seleth, and I invoke the right of challenge. A murmur ran through the Khazari soldiers, and even Reth seemed momentarily taken aback. You cannot invoke the right of challenge, he said. You are cubs who have not completed your maturity trials. The right of challenge can be invoked by any Alpha bloodline member against any who threaten their pack, Tasana replied, and her voice did not waver. And this human is my pack. That is absurd. I have declared her pack mother of the Alpha bloodline, Tasana continued. By the traditions of our people, attacking her is an attack on Alpha authority, and any who do so must answer the challenge or forfeit their honor. Reth's face contorted with rage. You twist our traditions to protect human filth. I use our traditions as they were intended, Tasana shot back, to protect the pack from those who would destroy it. The Khazari soldiers looked uncertain now, glancing between Reth and the cubs with confusion. The right of challenge was ancient and sacred, woven into the deepest foundations of Khazari culture, and violating it carried consequences that even a Dominarch could not ignore. This changes nothing, Reth growled. I will kill you all and claim that you attacked me first, and no one will dare contradict me. He raised his blade again. Kill them, he ordered his soldiers. Kill them all. The soldiers hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, a sound split the night sky. It was the roar of engines, human engines, and Yuna looked up to see United Earth, Alliance dropships descending through the darkness with weapons already firing. The cavalry had arrived. The planning sessions took place in the deepest part of the drainage system, in a junction room that the cubs had converted into their hidden sanctuary. Yuna crawled through narrow tunnels that scraped against her shoulders and dropped into the room to find nearly 30 young faces watching her with expectation. Tessum had gathered maps scratched onto salvaged metal plates, and she spread them across the floor with the confidence of a general preparing for battle. The prisoners are held here, Tasana said, pointing to a location in the eastern section of the occupied zone, in what used to be a human courthouse before the invasion. Security consists of 12 guards during the day and 8 at night, Vorik added, with patrol rotations every 4 hours. The execution is scheduled for dawn on the 5th day. Kel said in his quiet voice. "In the central plaza, where all residents will be required to watch." Yuna studied the maps and felt the weight of 30 young lives pressing down on her shoulders. "I cannot ask you to risk yourselves for this," she said. "You are not asking." Tazana replied, "We are offering. If any of you are caught, then we will be caught doing something that matters." A new voice interrupted, and Yuna turned to see a cub she did not recognize stepping forward from the group. "This is Nari," Tazana said. "She joined us last week after her parents were executed for failing to meet production quotas." Nari was thin and scarred, with one ear torn and healed badly. But her eyes burned with something that Yuna recognized as the fire of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I have watched my people become monsters," Nari said. "And I have watched your people suffer because of those monsters. And I am tired of watching." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered cubs, and Yuna realized that she was looking at something she had not expected to find in this place. She was looking at a revolution. "Very well," she said. "Then let us plan this properly, over the next 3 days." Yuna and the cubs mapped every aspect of the rescue operation. The young Kesari moved through the occupied zone like ghosts, gathering information and testing routes and identifying weaknesses that no adult would ever notice. Yuna taught them techniques that she had learned from emergency response training, simple ways to disable electronics and create distractions and move through hostile environments without being detected. "The key is coordination," she explained during one of their planning sessions. "We cannot overpower them with force, so we must overwhelm them with confusion. The adults always expect threats to come from other adults," Tazana observed. "They never look down." Exactly. The plan took shape over countless hours of discussion and revision on the night before the execution. The cubs would move into position throughout the facility and the surrounding area at the signal. They would begin a cascade of small disruptions: power failures, false alarms, jammed doors, and mysterious noises that would scatter the guards and create chaos in that chaos. Yuna would enter the detention area and lead the prisoners out through the drainage system to an extraction point beyond the occupied zone. "It is a good plan," Vorik said with the confidence of youth. "It will work. Many things can go wrong," Yuna cautioned. "Many things can go right," Tazana countered. "And we will make sure they do." On the 4th day, everything nearly fell apart and Yuna was working in the medical facility when Overseer Veth summoned her to his office with an expression that made her blood run cold. "There have been reports of disruptions throughout the base," Veth said, his yellow eyes fixed on her face. "Small things individually, but together they form a pattern." "What sort of disruptions?" "Equipment malfunctions, supplies going missing, guards reporting strange sounds in the maintenance tunnels." Veth leaned forward across his desk. "And all of these incidents seem to have increased since your arrival." "I have been working in the medical facility as ordered," Yuna said, keeping her voice steady. "I do not have time for sabotage, even if I had the inclination." "Perhaps," Veth said. "Or perhaps you are more clever than you appear." He studied her for a long moment, and Yuna forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "Dominarch Reth has taken an interest in you," Veth continued. "He believes that you are more than a simple medical worker, and he has ordered increased surveillance on your activities." "I am exactly what I appear to be," Yuna said. "A doctor who came here to help people." "We shall see," Veth said, echoing his words from her first day. "You are dismissed." Yuna walked back to her quarters with her heart pounding and her mind racing if Reth was watching her closely. Any contact with the cubs could expose the entire network. She could not risk meeting them tonight, could not risk anything that might draw attention. But when she reached her quarters, she found a small object sitting on her pillow. It was a stone carved into the shape of a human hand. and wrapped around it was a scrap of cloth with Kasari writing that her translator rendered as, "We see you being watched and we are watching the watchers, and the plan continues." Yuna felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized what the cubs had done. They had anticipated that she might be placed under surveillance, and they had already adapted somewhere in the shadows. 30 children were moving pieces into place for a rescue that would either save 12 lives or end many more. That night, Yuna did not try to contact the cubs. She ate her meal and went through her normal routine and lay in her bed as if she had nothing more on her mind than another day of medical work. But she did not sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Minjae and the other prisoners, counting down their final hours. She thought about Tisana and Varric and Kel, who had lost their parents to the very regime they were now defying. She thought about Nari and all the other cubs who had found purpose in rebellion after their society had thrown them away, and she thought about Dominar Treth, who had ordered the deaths of children and prisoners alike without hesitation. Tomorrow night, everything would change. Either they would succeed and strike a blow against the occupation that no one would forget, or they would fail and die in ways that Yuna did not want to imagine. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness, and Yuna watched the darkness outside her window shift toward the gray of pre-dawn. When the morning came, she rose and dressed and went to the medical facility as if it were any other day. She treated patients and followed orders and smiled at the guards who watched her with new suspicion, and all the while, she counted the hours until nightfall. When evening finally arrived, Yuna returned to her quarters and waited. The plan called for action to begin at the 3rd hour after sunset, when the night guards would be settled into their routines and the facility would be at its most vulnerable. She had no way to communicate with the cubs, no way to confirm that everything was in place, no way to know if the plan had already been compromised. She could only trust at the appointed hour. Yuna slipped out of her window and into the drainage channel below. The darkness was absolute, but small hands found her almost immediately and guided her forward. "This way." Kel's whisper came from somewhere ahead. "The first disruption begins in 2 minutes." Yuna let herself be led through tunnels that she could not see, trusting the cubs to guide her through. Somewhere above them, the occupied zone waited in unsuspecting silence. Somewhere ahead, 12 prisoners waited for a rescue they did not know was coming, and all around her, an army of forgotten children waited for the signal to rise. Varric returned the next night as promised, but he did not come alone. Yuna heard the soft scratching at her window and opened it to find 3 young Kasari waiting in the drainage channel below. Varric stood at the front with his bandaged foreleg held more confidently than before, and behind him stood 2 other cubs who watched Yuna with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "This is Tisana," Varric said, gesturing to the larger of the 2 newcomers. "She is my elder sister, and she leads our pack." Tisana was taller than Varric by perhaps a foot, and her scales were darker, almost black in the dim light. Her eyes held an intelligence and wariness that made Yuna think of old soldiers rather than young children. "And this is Kel," Varric continued, pointing to the smallest cub. "He is our youngest brother." Kel barely came up to Yuna's waist, and he pressed close to Tisana as if trying to hide behind her bulk. "Varric says you helped him without asking for anything in return," Tisana said, and her voice through the translator was cautious and measured. "I need to understand why." "Because he was hurt," Yuna replied, "and helping those who are hurt is what I do. Humans and Kasari are at war. You are children," Yuna said simply. "And in my experience, children are not responsible for the wars their elders choose to fight." Tisana studied her for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "We have been hiding for 7 months," she said. "Ever since Dominar Reth killed our parents and claimed their territory for himself." "Reth," Yuna repeated, filing the name away in her memory. He is the military commander of this sector, Tasana explained. And he has been hunting us since the night he murdered our mother and father. Because as long as alpha bloodline cubs survive, his claim to power can be challenged. How have you survived so long? By becoming invisible, Vorik said with a hint of pride. We move through the drainage systems and maintenance tunnels, and we watch and listen and learn. And the adults forget that we exist because cubs are considered worthless until we pass our maturity trials. Yuna looked at these three young creatures who had learned to survive through silence and shadows, and she felt something tighten in her chest. Come inside, she said. Stepping back from the window, it is cold tonight, and I have food. The cubs exchanged glances. And then Tasana nodded and led her brothers through the window into Yuna's small quarters. They ate the ration bars that Yuna offered with a hunger that spoke of too many missed meals. And as they ate, Takaduna learned that the alpha bloodline cubs had been watching her since she first entered Kasari territory, noting how she never showed aggression toward young Kasari workers and how she treated injured patients regardless of species. Most humans look at cubs the same way they look at adults, Tasana said. With fear and hatred, but you looked at us with something different. Curiosity, Yuna admitted. And perhaps recognition. Recognition of what? Of children trying to survive in a world that has decided they are expendable. Kel spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. Will you help us like you helped Vorik? Yuna knelt so that she was at eye level with the smallest cub. I will help you however I can, she said. But I need you to understand that I am not safe either. And being connected to me might put you in more danger. We are already in danger every moment of every day, Tasana said flatly. At least with you, we would not be alone. From that night forward, the cubs became Yuna's shadow family. They came to her window after dark and shared meals and stories. And Yuna taught them human games that made Kel laugh for what Tasana said was the first time since their parents died. In return, the cubs began bringing Yuna information. It started small. Observations about patrol schedules and which guards were lazy about checking credentials. But it quickly grew into something more substantial. Vorik had a talent for eavesdropping on conversations. And he reported troop movements and supply shipments with an accuracy that would have impressed military intelligence. Sesson mapped the entire underground network of the occupied zone in her head. And she could tell Yuna the fastest route between any 2 points without being seen. Kel, despite his shyness, had a memory that bordered on perfect. And he could recite entire conversations he had overheard days earlier without missing a single word. There are human prisoners being held in the eastern compound, Vorik reported one night. I heard the guards talking about them. Yuna's heart lurched at the words. How many prisoners? 12, Kel said quietly. 7 soldiers and 5 civilians. And one of the civilians is a scientist that the guards call Park. Minjae was Alavi. Yuna had to force herself to breathe normally as hope and fear warred in her chest. Can you show me where the compound is? We can do better than that, Tasana said. We can show you every entrance and exit, every guard rotation, and every weakness in their security over the following weeks. The cubs expanded their network. Yuna learned that Vorik and his siblings were not the only outcasts. Hiding in the shadows of the occupied zone, there were cubs from disgraced families who had lost status in political struggles, cubs of mixed bloodlines who were considered impure, and cubs who had simply been abandoned when their parents decided they were not worth the trouble. Tasana reached out to these scattered children and brought them into the fold. And before Yuna fully understood what was happening, she found herself at the center of an intelligence network that numbered nearly 30 young Kasari. They move through places that adults cannot fit, Tasana explained. And they hear things that adults assume no one is listening to, because in Kasari society, cubs are invisible until they prove themselves worthy of notice. "This is dangerous," Yuna said. "If any of them are caught, we are already in danger." Tazana repeated the words she had spoken weeks before. "But now we have a purpose. And purpose makes the danger easier to bear." Yuna struggled with what she was doing. She had never intended to build a spy network out of children. And the thought of any of these cubs being hurt because of her made her sick with guilt, but she could not deny that the information they gathered was invaluable. And she could not deny that the cubs themselves seemed more alive now that they had something to fight for one night. Tazana approached Yuna with an unusual expression on her young face. "The others have started calling you something," she said. "What do they call me?" "Quiet Hunter," Tazana replied. "It is a term of respect among our people, given to those who achieve great things through patience and stealth rather than brute force." Yuna was not sure how to respond to that. "I am not hunting anything," she said finalitesna, made a sound that Yuna had learned to recognize as Kazari laughter. "You are hunting the most dangerous prey of all," the young Kasari said. "You are hunting hope in a place where hope was supposed to have died." 3 nights later, Varric came to Yuna's window with news that changed everything. "The 12 human prisoners are going to be executed," he said, his young voice tight with urgency. "Dominar Tereth has ordered a public display in 5 days to show his power and break the spirit of any humans who still resist." Yuna felt the blood drain from her face. "Are you certain?" "Kel heard the order himself," Varric said. "And one of the prisoners scheduled for execution matches the description of the scientist. Park. 5-day Sienna had 5 days to do the impossible. To rescue 12 prisoners from the heart of enemy territory, using nothing but her wits and an army of children that no one knew existed." She looked at Varric and saw not fear but determination in his young eyes. "Tell Tazana to gather everyone," Yuna said quietly. "We have planning to do." Varric nodded and disappeared into the shadows. And Yuna stood alone in her small room, facing the weight of what she was about to attempt. Somewhere in this hostile place, Minjay and 11 others were counting down the days to their deaths, and somewhere in the shadows, 30 forgotten children were waiting for a human woman to show them what hope looked like. Yuna closed her eyes and began to plan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the demilitarized zone as Dr. Yuna Siong walked alone toward enemy territory. She carried nothing but a medical bag and a translation device strapped to her wrist. And she wore the white uniform of a humanitarian worker rather than the armor of a soldier. Behind her stood the last checkpoint of United Earth Alliance territory, where Captain Dowan had tried one final time to convince her not to go. "You understand this is suicide," he had said. Yuna had simply nodded and kept walking. 3 months of brutal war between humanity and the Kasari. Dominion had left thousands dead on both sides. And somewhere in the occupied zone ahead, a research partner, Minjay Park, was being held as a prisoner of war. The official mission was a medical exchange, a gesture of goodwill that both sides had reluctantly agreed to. The unofficial mission was intelligence gathering, and if fortune favored her, finding the prisoners that the Khazari claimed did not exist. The first Khazari checkpoint loomed ahead, a structure of black metal and sharp angles that seemed designed to intimidate guards emerged as she approached, and Yuna forced herself to keep her breathing steady. The Khazari were tall creatures that combined features of wolves and reptiles in ways that human eyes found deeply unsettling. They stood on powerful hind legs covered in dark scales, but their faces were elongated and furry, filled with teeth that gleamed in the morning light. Their eyes were yellow and slitted, and they watched Yuna with the cold assessment of predators evaluating prey. "Human female," one guard growled through the translator. "You enter Khazari territory by permission of the Dominion, and you exist here by our mercy alone." "I understand," Yuna replied, keeping her voice calm and her hands visible. You will be escorted to the medical facility in Sector 7, and you will remain there unless given permission to leave. I understand. The guard stepped closer, towering over her by nearly 2 feet, and his nostrils flared as he inhaled her scent. You smell of fear, he said with what might have been amusement. Which shows you are not entirely stupid. Yuna said nothing, and after a long moment the guard stepped aside and gestured for her to proceed. She walked through the checkpoint with her heart pounding against her ribs. And she did not look back. The occupied zone had once been a human colony called New Horizon, but 3 months of Kasari occupation had transformed it into something alien, and hostile human buildings had been torn down or repurposed. And Kasari architecture rose in their place, like the bones of great beasts. The streets were patrolled by soldiers who watched Yuna with expressions ranging from contempt to hunger, and she kept her eyes forward and her pace steady. But as she walked, she noticed something else. Small faces watched her from shadows and doorways. Faces that belonged to young Kasari, who had not yet grown into the massive frames of adult cubs. She realized the children of the occupying forces. They watched her with something that looked less like hostility and more like curiosity. And when she met their eyes, they did not snarl or look away. They simply watched, silent and attentive, as if she were a puzzle they were trying to solve. The medical facility was a converted human hospital that now served both Kasari wounded and the remaining human civilians who had not been evacuated before the invasion. A Kasari administrator named Overseer Veth assigned Yuna to a small room in the staff quarters and made it clear that she was expected to work, not to wander. You will treat patients as directed, Veth said, and you will report any suspicious activity among the human population. I am here to heal, Yuna replied, not to spy on my own people. Veth's lips pulled back from his teeth in what might have been a smile. We shall see what you are here for, he said, and left her alone in her cramped quarters. That night, Yuna lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the occupied zone. Kasari voices barked orders in the distance, and patrol vehicles hummed through the streets. And somewhere far away something howled at the alien stars. She was just beginning to drift towards sleep when she heard a scratching sound outside her window. Yuna froze, her hand moving slowly toward the small knife she kept hidden in her medical bag. The scratching continued, followed by a soft whimpering sound that made her pause. That was not the sound of an attacker. She moved to the window and looked out into the drainage channel that ran behind the staff quarters. And in the dim light she saw a small shape huddled against the wall. It was a Kasari cub, perhaps the equivalent of a human child of 8 or 9 years. And even from a distance, Yuna could see that something was wrong. The cub was holding its foreleg close to its chest, and the fur around the limb was matted with something dark against every instinct of self-preservation. Yuna opened her window and climbed out into the drainage channel. The cub scrambled backward at her approach, baring small teeth that had not yet grown into the fearsome fangs of an adult. I am not going to hurt you, Yuna said softly. Holding up her empty hands, the cub growled, but the sound was weak and tinged with pain. Your arm is hurt, Yuna continued, and I can see the infection from here. So if you do not let someone treat it, you will lose the limb or worse. The cub's yellow eyes studied her face with an intelligence that surprised her. Why would you help me? It asked, and the translator rendered its voice as young and suspicious. Because you are a child, Yuna said simply, and you are in pain. She knelt slowly and opened her medical bag, removing antiseptic and bandages with careful movements. Cub watched every motion with the wariness of a creature that had learned not to trust. But it did not run. The adults will kill you if they find you helping me, the cub said. Then we should be quiet about it. Yuna gestured for the cub to come closer, and after a long hesitation, it did. The wound was bad. a deep gash that had become infected and was beginning to spread poison through the small body. Yuna worked quickly and gently, cleaning the wound and applying medicine that made the cub hiss in pain but did not cause it to pull away. "What is your name?" she asked as she wrapped the bandage. "Vorik," the cub said. "I am Yuna." "I know who you are," Vorik replied. "We have been watching you since you arrived." Yuna paused in her work. "We?" "My siblings and I," Vorik said. And something in his young voice carried a weight that did not belong to a child. "We watch everyone. Because watching is how we survive." "Why you need to survive?" Yuna asked carefully. "Are you not children of the soldiers stationed here?" Vorik's eyes grew hard, despite his youth. "We are children of the Alpha bloodline," he said. "And when our parents were killed by those who wanted their power, we became something to be hunted rather than protected." Yuna finished the bandage and sat back on her heels, looking at this small creature, who spoke of death and survival with the weariness of someone far older. "You can come back tomorrow night," she said quietly, "and I will check the wound and change the bandage." Vorik stared at her for a long moment. "You are strange," he said finally. "You smell of fear, but you act without it. And you help an enemy child as if it were your own." "Perhaps," Yuna said. "I do not see an enemy child, but simply a child." Vorik rose and tested his bandaged limb, then looked back at her with an expression she could not read. "I will return," he said. "And perhaps I will not come alone." He disappeared into the shadows of the drainage system, moving with a silence that spoke of long practice. And Yuna climbed back through her window with the knowledge that she had just done something that could get her killed. But as she lay in the darkness waiting for sleep, she found that she did not regret it somewhere in this hostile place. A wounded child would sleep better tonight because a stranger had chosen kindness over fear that she decided was worth the risk.